I still remember the salty wind rolling off the Chesapeake Bay that morning, carrying the faint sound of gulls and distant boat horns. My hands were tucked deep into the pockets of my coat as I approached the Naval Academy gates, heart steady but heavy. I wasn't here for anyone's permission. I had my own reasons for walking through those iron bars. Still, I didn't expect to be stopped mid-step. "Ma'am, you're not on the list," the young petty officer said, his voice polite but firm. And just like that, years of family history seemed to tighten around my chest. Ryan stepped out of a black SUV just beyond the gate, his white dress uniform gleaming in the sun. My younger brother, the golden boy, the one our parents spoke about with a sparkle in their eyes. He took one glance at me, then leaned toward his wife and said loudly enough for the guard to hear, "She should have married a real officer. All she does is push paper." The words didn't pierce me. They froze me like the sudden shadow of a cloud on a bright day. Everyone around me kept moving, but my world stood still. My parents walked past without a pause. My mother fiddled with her pearl brooch, as if the clasp suddenly demanded all her attention. My father gave me a look, not pity, not concern, but quiet disapproval, as if my very presence risked embarrassing them. No one vouched for me. No one said my name. I was a ghost at the gates of a life I'd never been allowed to fully belong to. The petty officer cleared his throat. "Ma'am, I'll need you to step aside." I did, stepping into the shadows, not out of weakness, but out of something far stronger. That was the moment I realized silence isn't always strength. Sometimes it's an eraser. And my story, my real story, wasn't meant to be erased. What my family didn't know, what they'd never even guessed, was that the so-called desk job they dismissed had saved more lives than they could imagine. Lives of people they'd never meet. Lives that would go on to hold their children to dream their own dreams. And today the truth would finally meet the light. Not for revenge, not for validation, but because it was time. The guard's words echoed longer than they should have, bouncing around in the quiet corners of my mind. "Ma'am, you're not on the list." It wasn't just about entry, it was about belonging. I could have argued, could have pulled rank, but that's never been my way. In my family, I'd learned early that pushing back only made the walls higher. I stood there watching the sunlight glint off brass buttons and polished shoes, thinking about how absence on a paper list could feel heavier than any chain. Sometimes rejection isn't loud. Sometimes it comes in a neat printed font. Ryan's voice carried easily over the morning air, crisp and deliberate. "She should have married a real officer. All she does is push paper." I felt the words brush past me, aimed at the guard, but meant for everyone within earshot. It was a performance, and I was the prop. He didn't have to look at me to make the point. I remembered other moments like this: family dinners, where my work was a punchline, holiday gatherings, where I was introduced with a shrug, in our house uniforms with medals, outranked uniforms with pens. My mother's pearls caught the light as she adjusted them, eyes fixed anywhere but me. My father's jaw tightened, not in defense, but in warning. "Don't make a scene. I've seen that look my whole life. It's the look that tells you the problem isn't what happened to you, it's that other people saw it happen." They walked past me side by side into the academy grounds without a word. In that instant, I wasn't just excluded from an event. I was being erased from the narrative entirely, like I'd never been part of this family's story. There's a particular kind of pain in being invisible to people who share your name. It's not the sharp sting of an argument. It's the slow ache of being overlooked over and over again. I'd felt it before in living rooms, filled with Ryan's trophies and phone calls that always ended with "we'll talk soon," but never did. You start to wonder if you're partly to blame, if maybe you made it too easy for them to forget. But deep down, I knew the truth they didn't forget. They chose not to see. I stepped aside, the gravel crunching under my boots. The petty officer gave me an apologetic look, but he followed orders. In the quiet, I felt something harden, not bitterness, but clarity. My absence from that list didn't change my worth. It only revealed how much they misunderstood it. That morning wasn't the first time my value had been dismissed, but it would be the last time I stayed silent about it. Because there's a difference between being humble and letting yourself be erased. And I had no intention of disappearing. The truth was coming, and it was bigger than all of us. My family liked to picture me in a beige cubicle somewhere in Washington, sipping coffee from a chipped mug, while I typed endless reports. In their minds, my work ended when the clock hit 5. They didn't know about the nights I spent in a room without windows surrounded by glowing maps and encrypted feeds headset pressing into my ear. They didn't know that when the world was sleeping, I was tracking hostile vessels, counting heartbeats on thermal scans, and making calls that decided whether someone's son or daughter came home alive. And I never told them. Secrecy wasn't a burden, it was the job. I'd learned to wear it like a second uniform. When people asked what I did, I'd smile and say, intelligence work, knowing they'd picture something far smaller than reality. But the truth was bigger, heavier. A single wrong assessment could trigger an international crisis. A single missed signal could mean a folded flag on someone's mantle. I remember one mission where I delayed a green-lighted raid by 90 seconds. 90 seconds that exposed an ambush. 90 seconds that saved an entire team, my team. The most vivid memory was the night in the Strait of Hormuz. A civilian tanker had been hijacked, 12 lives trapped below deck. The SEAL team was minutes from breaching when I noticed an unmarked vessel drifting toward them on thermal. 6 heat signatures, no lights, no radio chatter. It didn't fit. Viper 1 hold position, I ordered, voice steady, though my pulse wasn't. They listened. The second boat carried heavily armed hostiles waiting to flank the boarding party. We rerouted. No one died. That kind of work leaves no pictures for the mantle, but it leaves lives intact. The irony, one of those SEALs had served under Ryan years before. I didn't mention it. While I was in that cold, humming command center, keeping his former men from walking into a kill zone, Ryan was probably laughing at some story about his paper-pushing sister. It's strange how the people closest to you can know the least about who you really are. Not because you've hidden yourself poorly, but because they never thought to look beyond their version of you. That night, I decided I'd lived in their version long enough. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that people will fill in the blanks about your life with whatever story benefits them. My silence had made it easy. But silence can't last forever, not when the truth has weight, and that weight is pressing against the walls you've built. 2 days after that scene at the gates, the call came. A general, a declassification order. And with it the first crack in the walls my family had built around me. The truth was coming into daylight, and I was finally ready to let them see it. Growing up in the Monroe household meant learning early where the spotlight fell and where it didn't. Ryan had it from the start. He was the star quarterback, the honor roll student, the one who could charm a room with a grin. I was the quiet one with notebooks full of science experiments and half-finished stories. When Ryan scored a touchdown, the whole family filled the stands. When I won my first statewide science fair, my parents sent a polite congratulatory text and reminded me to call my grandmother. It was never unkind, but it was always unequal. I remember the summer Ryan got his acceptance letter to the Naval Academy. My dad fired up the grill, invited half the neighborhood, and hung a banner in the backyard that read, Future Admiral. That same week, I stood on a stage in D.C., receiving a National Science Award for designing an encryption algorithm. I handed the medal to my father, hoping he'd see it as something to be proud of. He smiled, patted my shoulder, and went back to discussing Ryan's training schedule with an old Navy buddy. The message was clear, my lane was smaller. It wasn't just the big moments. At Thanksgiving dinners, conversations orbited around Ryan's deployments, his leadership, his medals. My own stories, like the time I coordinated disaster relief communications during a hurricane, were politely acknowledged, then brushed aside. It's easy to start thinking maybe you're overreacting, that maybe their pride in him doesn't mean a lack of pride in you. But over the years, the pattern wears grooves in your self-worth. The truth is, being invisible to your family doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow fade until you almost believe you're not worth noticing. The irony is outside the family people saw me differently. Professors encouraged me. Commanding officers trusted me with sensitive missions. Mentors told me I had leadership in my bones. But when I walked through my parents' front door, all of that seemed to evaporate. I became Ryan's sister again, the one who works with computers in some vague, unimpressive way. Looking back, I realized the problem wasn't that they didn't know my worth. It was that their definition of worth didn't include me. That's a hard truth to swallow, but it's freeing once you name it. The lesson I carry from those years is simple. You can't force people to see you, but you can refuse to shrink yourself to fit their vision. It took me decades to understand that my value didn't hinge on their acknowledgement. Still, when General Sullivan's call came, something in me stirred. Maybe it was time to step into the light they'd kept me from. Maybe it was time for them to see me not just as their daughter or sister, but as the officer I'd fought to become. And the chance to do that was closer than I thought. 2 mornings after the scene at the Academy gates, my office phone rang just as the sun began spilling gold across the Potomac. I was reviewing satellite intercepts, the hum of servers in the background, when I saw the caller ID Gen. Sullivan. His voice was steady, deliberate. "Captain Monroe, I have a declassification order for Operation Iron Wave. The President has signed it." My pen froze midair. In one breath, the work I'd carried silently for years was no longer locked away. The whole truth had been cleared to step into daylight, and I knew exactly where it belonged. General Sullivan's tone softened. "You saved 12 civilians, prevented a regional conflict, and protected one of our destroyers from catastrophic loss. That's not a footnote, Captain, it's a headline. I think it's time certain people see what you've done." I didn't need him to say who he meant. My mind flicked back to the gate, to Ryan's smirk, to my parents' averted eyes. Part of me resisted the idea public recognition was never why I served. But another part knew this wasn't just about me. It was about rewriting a story they'd told for years without my consent. He explained why now. With certain threats neutralized and diplomatic channels stabilized, releasing the operation details would bolster Navy morale and remind the public of the value of intelligence work. People need to understand, he said, that battles aren't only fought with bullets. I thought about how often my job had been reduced to pushing paper, as if lives weren't hanging on every line I read. This was a chance to correct that narrative, not just in my family's eyes, but in the minds of anyone who underestimated the quiet side of service. Still, I hesitated. Recognition comes with its own shadows. Public ceremonies meant attention, and attention meant questions some I couldn't answer without crossing into classified ground. I remembered a friend, a fellow officer, whose life became a revolving door of interviews after her commendation. She once told me the medal's the easy part. Living with what people think it means is harder. But when I imagined standing in that hall in uniform with General Sullivan telling the story himself, I realized the risk was worth it. Not to prove them wrong, but to finally stand in the truth. The decision settled quietly inside me like an anchor finding the ocean floor. "When's the ceremony?" I asked. Sullivan's chuckle was brief, but approving. "Your brother's is next month, correct? Seems like an ideal time." I felt the air shift in my chest. Not excitement, not revenge, but a deep, steady resolve. For years I'd let their version of me stand unchallenged. Now the facts would speak louder than any defense I could give. And as the date drew closer, I found myself preparing not for the applause, but for the look on their faces, when they realized who I really was. The morning of the ceremony, the air was crisp enough to carry the scent of the bay all the way to the Academy gates. I walked up in full dress uniform, the silver stars on my shoulders, catching slivers of sunlight. It felt heavier than any gear I'd worn, because it wasn't just fabric and metal. It was history, responsibility, and a truth long overdue. The same guard from before stepped forward, tablet in hand, his eyes flicking up in confusion. This time, I didn't stop. A low hum rippled through the crowd as a black sedan rolled to a smooth halt beside me. General Sullivan stepped out, every inch the 4-star Admiral, his presence filling the space like a rising tide. He didn't hesitate, didn't glance at the guard, his eyes went straight to mine. "Rear Admiral Monroe," he said, voice loud enough for those lingering at the gate to hear we were about to send out a search party. The words landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples outward. I could feel dozens of eyes turn, including the ones I knew best. My parents froze. Ryan's smile faltered, confusion clouding his perfect posture. The guard's face drained of color as recognition dawned. He stepped back, nearly tripping over the chain barrier as he fumbled to open the gate. "Ma'am, Admiral, my apologies," he stammered. But I simply nodded the way you do when you've already made peace with something bigger than the moment. Sullivan offered his arm, an old-fashioned gesture, and I took it. The murmur of the crowd followed us inside, a mix of curiosity and disbelief. Some moments speak so loudly you don't have to raise your voice. This was one of them. I've learned that in the military, titles aren't just words, they're a currency of respect, hard-earned and carefully guarded. Hearing Rear Admiral spoken in front of the very people who once reduced me to paper pusher was a reminder of that currency. Respect can't be demanded from those who refuse to give it, but it can be earned in places they can't reach. And when it comes back to you, it carries the weight of every mile, every sacrifice, every silent victory they never saw. That's a kind of power you don't need to flaunt. As we walked deeper into the academy grounds, I caught sight of Ryan again. He was trying to mask the calculation happening behind his eyes, connecting dots, realizing this wasn't a favor or a courtesy. This was my own ceremony, anchored in its own merit. I didn't meet his gaze for long. Not yet. There would be a time for that, but first there was a hall full of uniforms waiting. The air inside buzzed with anticipation, and somewhere in the front row, the podium stood ready for a story only I could tell. Ryan's ceremony began just as it always had in our family's narrative, him at center stage, rows of brass and gold arrayed in the audience cameras, ready to catch every handshake. He walked up with that familiar ease, thanked our parents, his commanding officers, and his wife. Not a glance in my direction. If I hadn't known what was coming, it might have felt like the final erasure. But I sat quietly, my hands resting in my lap, letting the moment play out. Sometimes you have to let the old story run its course before the new one can begin. When General Sullivan took the podium again, the shift was almost imperceptible, just a change in his stance, a quieting of the room. "We have one more recognition this morning," he began, his voice low and deliberate. Conversations stilled. For reasons of national security, this honor has remained classified. Until today. Heads turned, brows furrowed. I could feel the tension building, like the slow rise of a tide, curiosity filling the air. Then he said it. "Rear Admiral Alexandra Monroe, please step forward." The room seemed to pause, as if even the air needed a moment to catch up. I rose without hesitation, the click of my shoes on the wooden floor echoing louder than I expected. My parents stared as though they'd seen a ghost. Ryan's expression froze somewhere between disbelief and the beginnings of realization. Sullivan spoke of Operation Iron Wave, of the 12 civilians, saved the ambush, prevented the destroyer, spared. His words were precise, but beneath them ran an undercurrent of deep respect. Then came the part that landed hardest. He named the destroyer I'd saved. Ryan knew that name. It was the one he'd once served aboard. The color drained from his face as the truth reached him, slow and irreversible. I didn't look away. This wasn't about humiliation. It was about revelation. The room erupted into applause, the kind that rolls in waves, pulling people to their feet. Every uniformed body stood except 3. My parents and Ryan remained seated, rooted in the weight of a story they'd never believed existed. And for the first time, that silence didn't hurt. It just told the truth. Some truths don't need defense. They stand on their own. Sullivan pinned the Distinguished Service Medal to my uniform, his hand firm on my shoulder. "Time to tell your story, Admiral," he murmured. And I knew he didn't just mean on this stage. Recognition isn't the end of the road, it's the opening of a door you once thought was sealed shut. I stepped back from the podium, knowing the next chapter wasn't about proving anything anymore. It was about living in the space I had earned. And that space would follow me far beyond the walls of this hall. 6 months later, I stood in my parents' living room, the scent of lemon polish and old books soft in the air. Against the far wall sat a new glass display case, handcrafted cherrywood, brass hinges, velvet lining. In the center, my Distinguished Service Medal rested beside a photo of General Sullivan, pinning it to my uniform. On the shelf below, Grandpa's folded flag and Ryan's commendation. My mother smoothed a wrinkle in the velvet as if tucking in a child. "Your father built it," she said. Her voice carried that careful hope people use when stepping onto thin ice they no longer want to break. At dinner, conversation didn't orbit like it used to. Instead of speaking at me, they spoke with me. Dad asked about interagency briefings, how you get 3 departments to agree when each believes it owns the truth. I gave a real answer, start with shared risk, not territory. He listened, really listened. Fork. Suspended, eyes steady. Mom asked what I missed most when I was deployed to the intelligence posts. No one photographs. I told her the truth. Fresh peaches, unplanned Saturdays, calling her without counting time zones. It wasn't a performance. It was contact. Repair didn't arrive like a parade. It came like weather, gradual, noticeable, only when you realized the air had changed. Ryan showed up with a box of pastries and a knot in his jaw. We sat on the porch steps where we'd once compared skinned knees. "I'm sorry," he said, eyes on the dark line of the street. "I needed to be the hero so badly I forgot you were one too." I didn't let him off easy, but I didn't make him drown either. We traded stories, not medals, stories. Where it hurt, where it healed, where we got it wrong. 2 weeks later, he invited me to brief his junior officers about quiet leadership. I told them how authority without curiosity becomes brittle. We walked through a real case study, scrubbing specifics about the 90-second delay that saved a team. I asked them to list the last decision they made that no one would ever thank them for. The room went still. Afterward, one lieutenant said, "Ma'am, I didn't know not getting credit could be a leadership skill." I smiled. "That's the lesson I wish someone had handed me at 22. Your integrity has to outlast your applause." At home, Mom began introducing me differently to neighbors. No more vague works with computers. She said, "This is my daughter, Alex. She keeps people safe." Not perfect words, but closer to the truth than we'd ever stood. Dad started mailing me articles, diplomacy, maritime security, even a paper on satellite queuing. In the margins, he'd underline a line and write, "Is this what you meant?" Sometimes repairing isn't about saying sorry once. It's about building a new language together, one question at a time. I won't pretend everything became easy. Old grooves tug at you when you're tired. Some holidays still tilt toward Ryan's stories. Some mornings I still brace for the smallest slight. But the difference now is agency. I don't sit quietly at the far end of the table waiting to be seen. I take my seat. I ask the next question. And when I feel myself shrinking, I remember the hall, the pin, the breath I took when the room stood. Tomorrow there's one last thing to do. Close the circle on my terms and carry this forward. Somewhere along the way I realized the medal wasn't the proof, it was the reminder. Proof tries to convince someone else. A reminder speaks to you. That piece of silver and ribbon wasn't about Operation Iron Wave anymore. It was about every quiet decision, every uncredited hour, every time I'd chosen service over being understood. For years I'd let my worth hinge on the wrong gatekeepers. Now I carried it myself. And the thing about carrying your own worth is you stop waiting for someone else to open the door. You walk in because you already know you belong. I began noticing it in the smallest choices. When a younger officer asked if her project was important enough to present to command, I told her what I wish I'd heard at her age: if it saves lives, strengthens the mission, or strengthens the people, it's important enough. When a community leader thanked me for protecting the country, I told him it's not just me. It's the analyst cross-referencing ship manifests at midnight, the comms tech double-checking frequencies. Carrying your worth also means recognizing it in others, especially when the world doesn't. That's how invisible work stays alive. One evening, I walked past the cherrywood display case in my parents' house. The glass reflected the soft light of a lamp, and for the first time, I didn't think about who built it or why. I thought about the thread between Grandpa's flag, Ryan's commendation, and my medal. 3 lives, 3 different shapes of service, all standing side by side. That's what I'd wanted all along, not to be the only story told, but to be part of the whole story. And it turns out you can't demand that. You can only live it until it's undeniable. The lesson is simple, but stubborn. Your worth isn't a debt someone else gets to forgive. It's not a prize to be awarded when you've met their terms. It's a constant, like a compass you keep in your pocket. You might hide it for a while or forget it's there, but it never stops pointing you back to yourself. When I stopped treating my worth like a secret, I found it easier to speak up, to mentor, to stand in rooms where I used to shrink. You can't build that confidence overnight. It's made of 1,000 small stands. If you've ever been dismissed, underestimated, or erased, I hope you remember this. The applause feels good, but the silence you choose for yourself, that's freedom. Drop a key in the comments if you've ever had to unlock your own worth. And if you're still looking for it, keep going. Sometimes the most important recognition comes when no one's watching. And when the moment finally comes to stand in the light, you'll already know how. Because you've been carrying it all along, and it's been carrying you too.